Oh, thanks very much, Greg. I've just got some notes if I need them, but I'm very much among friends, and it's great to see you all. I feel like it's one of those situations where I can learn a lot more from you than you will ever learn from me. And we'll have a Q&A, so it'll be an opportunity to have a bit of an interaction. Excuse my voice, I've got a slight lurgy, but that was not going to stop me from coming here, Greg. And the first thing I wanted to say, because politicians love to butter people up. You should all be aware of that by now. But I did want to say, you've played such a valuable role in thought leadership in Australia, and you're here to keep a lot of the rest of us honest. And part of the reason I'm here today is to make the point that if we are lucky enough to be the government after the 14th of September, we will need people in the private sector with the public interest at heart to keep us honest, to keep any government honest. Because I can assure you, in government, the urgent always crowds out the important. And you've always got to have an eye on the strategy about where you are going and why you are doing what you are doing. You can have all sorts of advice, technocratic advice, to tell you about this or that lever you can pull to do X, Y, or Z. But ultimately, as politicians, we've got to have a view about where we're going and why we're going there, and how we're going to get there, and motivate people to do it. I think we're at a very interesting juncture in Australia's economic history. Having been through this great super cycle that everybody loves to talk about, the fact of the matter is that we are facing harder times, and we're facing them at a time when, we've had 20 years of uninterrupted growth, and it's been fantastic, and it's partly a legacy of all the other reform that's occurred in this country. We've had 20 years of that, which particularly among younger people has probably got us used to the idea that expansion can just be uninterrupted. And yes, we also managed to sail through the global financial crisis for a whole variety of reasons I won't go into here, in a way that not many other countries did. And that's added to this idea that somehow we're inured to some of the forces outside. Well, we're not. There have been some special factors at work. Some of those are now washing through the economy. The rise in the terms of trade, that super rise in the terms of trade, the impact that had on national income, that's washing through. And so the future for us, really, over the next few years is, if we're maintaining living standards and raising national income, there's got to be more and more focus on productivity. Now, that's a very easy thing to say. It's a very easy thing to roll off the tongue and give an academic disquisition on. The practicality for politicians is how they turn that sort of reality into something that people out there tangibly can understand and relate to. Because often when you talk to people about the fact that the great imperative is to increase productivity, is for people to think, well, hang on, is that code for working harder or longer? Because we already work quite long hours in Australia. Is it code for cutting wages and conditions? What does this all mean? Now, I think of three things in this regard. And that's why when Greg asked me about what I was going to call this talk, I suggested Australia in a more competitive world, the role of initiative and innovation. The first part of that is we have to keep persuading and reminding Australians the world is getting more and more competitive every day. I often listen in the Senate to Penny Wong and others say we're going to compare Australia to the, quote, advanced nations, the UK, the US and Europe. But increasingly, you know this better than anybody. You look at what's happening in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, the way countries are changing their foreign investment regimes, improving their governance to attract capital. You look at the way countries like Brazil are becoming super economic powers of the future. Look at the investments they're making in strategic areas like science and technology and innovation, and I'm happy to come back to that later again. But the point is, the competition is everywhere. They're not out there waiting for us to succeed. And to some extent, of course, we've been fortunate because we've had this fantastic whoosh in the terms of trade off the back of commodity prices. And that is seen by many Australians as like a form of insurance. There's real money in the bank. And yes, it is in one sense. But what we've got to convince people is that none of this is preordained or guaranteed. Look at the way costs blew out during the resources boom we just had. Look at what it costs to get things done in Australia vis-a-vis other jurisdictions. And I'm not talking about the comparison with jurisdictions where they're paying $2 an hour. Our project costs blew out a heck of a lot. And now, of course, part of the response to what's going on as we adjust is because of the inflexibility in our structure, the only way to adjust a lot of those costs is through mass sackings. So we face a situation where we have to keep improving our competitiveness, because if we don't, other resource producers come along who are more nimble, more competitive, and they'll eat our lunch. And yes, we may have really quality resources in parts of WA and Queensland, but if the rest of the supply chain isn't efficient, and if costs of doing things blow out, and if you have to deal with two levels of government in order to get approvals for projects, and you have to face two sets of documentation, two sets of conditions, and you live in an economy where the regulatory mindset is very much one of, well, if you get through all these hurdles, good luck to you, you've got a project and on your way. You go up to a nimble, small state like Singapore. I was talking to a senior executive in one of the multinationals, and she was saying to me, an Australian multinational, she went up there with a proposal, spent an hour with the senior bureaucrats there. They looked at it, they were very well informed, they read about it. After an hour, they sat down looking at ways to get it done. It's a can-do mentality. Whereas here, it's a mentality of ticking all the boxes, and maybe if you get through, you're lucky. So I see the challenge very much as, at all levels, and people in business in the private sector obviously get it because you're out there at the edges and the frontiers of all of this. But it's making sure as a community we have a global mindset and we understand the competitive pressures we're under, and that none of this great bounty that we've got is guaranteed to be achieved if we aren't more competitive. And a lot of that competitiveness comes down to initiative, and it comes down to innovation. And what do I put under the term initiative? Well, for me, unabashedly, labour markets are part of the issue. They have to be. There is no way you can tell me that having a one-size-fits-all industrial relations system is appropriate for a modern 21st century economy. Now, there are a lot of ways in which we've adjusted to the inflexibilities in the labour market and sort of worked our way around them. And I'm not saying that having the perfect IR system is a silver bullet to Australia's issues, but it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for prosperity. So that's why the sort of policies Tony's put out for the campaign in terms of attacking particular areas like building and construction, the way the unions are governed or not governed, and how that can be better regulated, the ways in which we promote greater flexibility within the existing system as a down payment on then getting the Productivity Commission to have a proper look at the labour market, because for years we were told labour market is special. It's not like the market for bananas, it's the market for people, so how dare you raise the idea that economic analysis can somehow shed light on the trade-offs in this space. But what Abbott has said is we're prepared to have a Productivity Commission review of this to apply the same rigour there that we apply in other sectors of the economy, and the results of that, if we win this election and get to do the PC review, would go to a second election and have a second instalment of change. Again, opening the door to more change, more happening. That's important. That initiative bit is important, and a lot of it comes down to labour market arrangements. If you go and talk to a cochlear, and Stephen Schwartz has been fantastic in hosting them out there in your old job at Macquarie Uni, where they've built this great cluster with Australian Hearing Services and with all these academics. One of their biggest beefs, apart from regulation, has been labour market issues. They've been targeted by a particular union at a time when they're paying well above the award, and all they're trying to do is create a proper relationship with their own employees. We've got to get away from this idea that you need a third party to be continually interposing. We need a management and an employee mentality where people engage directly. I'll stop sermonising on IR, but it's part of what we need to do, and we mustn't take our eye off the ball on those issues. Under initiative as well, one of the things that Tony's particularly interested in is how we maximise labour force participation. And I'm happy to come back to his signature policy on parental leave if you want to talk to me about that, but that is part of his agenda on labour force participation. Another part of his agenda is how we draw people with marginal attachment to the labour force back into the labour force. For us now, for the modern Liberal Party, getting people in jobless families, for example, people who've been on welfare for 2 or 3 generations into jobs, is core business. It's putting them on that ladder of opportunity that people like to talk about, including our old mate Mark Latham. The ladder of opportunity, that starts with giving people a break, but that also means looking at welfare to work in a holistic way. Labor picked up some of the stuff that we did in government, and they've done it recently with the parenting payment, and there have been some controversy around that. And parenthetically, I'll add, they didn't do the transition to welfare to work in the way that we did it, which gave more leeway to people being taken off parenting payment to find a job and have assistance in finding a job. But leave that aside. My point is this. Tony has a big focus on how we maximise labour force participation. Whether we're talking about female participation, we've talked about promoting the ongoing attachment of older workers to being in work. People are healthier for longer. So old views about when you retire and how the superannuation rules affect that. Rules about discrimination in the workplace, I can go through the list, but the point is older workers, maximising the opportunities for them as well. And as I said before, jobless families who are caught in a welfare trap, who are welfare dependent, and how we create better linkages between the tax and the transfer system. And I'll come back to tax in another context. So for me, initiative covers what we do in the workplace in terms of more flexibility, and it covers how, as a government, we restructure government policies that perpetuate welfare dependence as opposed to creating better linkages between welfare and work. And that labour force participation area for Tony is particularly important when he looks at the most disadvantaged group in the community, and that is Indigenous Australians. And those of you who have read the work of Helen Hughes and others will know that the most successful Indigenous Australians are the ones in the cities who are being treated as part of the mainstream community, rather than us, for culturally sensitive reasons, saying that people in those outstations and those other places where no other jobs are available, we should perpetuate that situation through the equivalent of the Community Development Employment Scheme, which essentially just pays them wages to be there. We need to engage Indigenous Australians in those areas in ways that promote their participation in the broader society. And one of the revolutions in the Northern Territory in the last few years is that politically, grassroots Indigenous organisations are pushing the same message. And those new Indigenous members of the Northern Territory House of Assembly are actually the ones in the vanguard of improving those linkages between welfare to work. It's a very, very good development, and it's something Tony's particularly attached to. Under the heading of innovation, the point I want to make is this. You go around Australia and everybody talks to you about things like the importance of manufacturing, the importance of the automotive industry as being a centre for R&D, high-tech engineering, all the rest of it. And that's fine. No one argues against us being an economy with lots of R&D, lots of high-tech, big interest in science, technology, engineering, the whole shebang. The question is how you do it. And one of the concerns I've got is that for years we've talked about the fact that we come up with a lot of good ideas in Australia, but our capacity to commercialise here seems to be limited. Now, part of it is because we're a small market. And if you've got a really good invention or development, well, you'll go to where the highest bidder is. And often that's the US, or it might be China these days, or whatever. But my point is, we don't commercialise as much as we should, given that in many areas of invention and the like, we punch above our weight. So we need to find better ways to link what we do in the academic sector, what we do in public sector research institutions, with the right sort of private sector collaborators. There are models, whether it's Cochlear, CSL, ResMed, who've built on our great investment over the years in health and medical research. But it's about finding those models elsewhere. The government talks about hubs and clusters. Now, my view on that is often the best clusters are the ones that sort of grow organically, right? Because it's a bit like a market. It grows organically because people find useful linkages and reasons to exchange. And a lot of the universities, I find, are very good places to have those sorts of clusters. And it's really making sure we're facilitating those commercial linkages. I have a big interest in the regional universities, particularly ones in the Hunter, because I'm from there originally and I'm the patron centre for the Central Coast and the Hunter. The University of Newcastle does a great job in being a regional driver of economic development and growth. The same in Wollongong with their innovation centre and the like. And the question I'm posing, as much, I don't have the full solution, is how we promote more of those sorts of clusters. And in that regard, I also think it's important that we keep focusing on how we develop our major cities as global cities, like the way we govern Sydney, for example. So there's more focus on being a global city. And the reason that is important is because artistic people, creative people, opinion makers, people with sway in the world economy are attracted to global cities. They become the places where decisions are made. And the idea that we become a branch economy where decisions are increasingly made elsewhere is not a great outcome for Australia in terms of our economic destiny. With respect to my counterparts in New Zealand, I mean, you know, New Zealand is a great case, or South Australia within the Australian Federation, of where increasingly the decisions about its future have been made elsewhere. Although New Zealand's reforming, Mr. Weiss, and they seem to be taking more of the destiny into their own hands, which is great under John Key. But my point is, all of these things link together, and it's about the role government can play, not in directing this, right? Because most of the time, governments are not that good at picking the winners. And because of the way politics works, it's always the tyranny of the status quo. That's why you have so much assistance for sunset industries. Essentially, you get captured by the status quo. The other point I want to make, and I'll sort of finish on this point because I think we need to get to Q&A, is if I look at the SME sector, that is an important driver of innovation and change and flexibility. And so anything we can do as a government, and we've identified a number of policies around promoting less red tape, less inhibitors to the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises, I think is important to help creating that edge in innovation that we're talking about. I guess my final point is about style. Part of what Tony has said around the way he wants to conduct government is a more deliberative style, a more consultative style. You would have seen the way the mining tax came along, how that was imposed. You would have seen the way that the Henry Review was dropped on the public. The Treasurer ruled out a number of what he thought were particularly contentious items, and then there was no real debate around tax. And the government then went ahead with the mining tax, thinking politically it would be an easy tax to implement, because the target was the foreign multinationals who run our mining industry. There would be a lot of money for very little effort, and it very much fits in with that class warfare mentality of senior leaders of the government. Always go back to a politician's maiden speech, because they're often repeating things that they said in their maiden speech. In the case of Wayne Swan, you go back to his maiden speech in the 90s, it was full of this idea that he joined the Labor Party because the bosses would always exploit the workers, and his father always believed that the banks were really evil people. And so you have this situation where you have this view of the world about who needs to be protected from whom. But my point on tax is that Tony is saying on tax, let's go back, let's revisit Henry, but let's have, he calls it a white paper process. What he means by that is a proper consultation on what's in it. And yes, let's be prepared to put things on the table that weren't there before, like the GST. And how does that link in to the broader architecture of the tax system? And if you do that, you can also use that sort of process to look at the tax and transfer system and the linkages between people on welfare, how they transition into work, and how you make sure they retain sufficient of what they gain from getting into work, that there's an incentive to get into work. Very important process. The final part of the puzzle on this, in terms of consultation, is around the relationship with the states. And what Tony's saying there is, look, philosophically, we don't mind competitive federalism, right? We don't mind states and territories competing on economic fundamentals, and that's great, which means you don't have to have a one-size-fits-all. You don't have harmonisation for its own sake. You can have harmonisation where it makes sense for everybody, in other words, where the national benefits outweigh the costs, but not if some jurisdictions have got to bear costs that are not really related to their own circumstances. My point is this. He's saying he wants to declutter the whole Council of Australian Governments agenda, the COAG agenda. And what does that mean? It means more of a focus on priority areas like reducing regulation, reducing overlap and duplication. He used the example of health. I was talking to Nicholas about this before in the speech itself about the overlap between federal departments like health and their state counterparts. And what Abbott is saying is in the areas where the states are sovereign, and these sort of service delivery areas are very much their areas of responsibility, the Commonwealth should be prepared to defer to them and not necessarily be second-guessing them, looking over their shoulder the whole time. So he's potentially laying out an agenda around reducing that overlap and duplication. It also goes to the way projects are approved, having more of a one-stop shop around environmental approvals. So there's a whole slew of things you can do in that area. Now, this all sounds terrific, and in the run-up to elections, it's very easy for oppositions to really sound optimistic and confident about how much better life will be. But I can tell you now from some of the things that Tony has said in recent times, he said there will be decisions a future government makes if we're elected that people may not like. But we're prepared to go out there and argue the case for it. And if the terms of trade are declining more than perhaps the government has factored in, and we face a much sharper adjustment than perhaps some people have factored in, then we have to be prepared to inoculate against that, explain to the public why that is happening and what are the ways in which we can meet that adjustment. We don't have to have an actual crisis to get people to accept change is necessary. The reception to the recent budget, where there seemed to be a lot of people in the community who accepted certain things that maybe people thought were sacrosanct. Oh, you wouldn't cut this or you wouldn't cut that. They accepted it. People are far more pragmatic and sensible. Look at the public's reaction to the global financial crisis. They raised their own savings from 0 to 10%. They started to tighten their belts, pay down their mortgages, reduce credit card debt, got themselves into better shape because they could see things had changed. They look at the federal government and they think, well, don't they? I mean, part of the reason I think our arguments on the budget have resonated is people look at the feds and they say, well, look, haven't the feds got the message that maybe times are a bit tougher, and how do they manage these things? And they told us they'd have surpluses because you have a deficit in the bad times and you rebuild in the good times, but they just keep spending. People think, well, as a country, part of the reason we've done well is because we had cash on hand, we had some insurance, a whole variety of reasons, but part of it was their view that we'd left the place in good shape, the debt was down, and therefore there was a capacity to be flexible when things became a little adverse. And so, to some extent, the political class, I'm saying at the moment, is starting to catch up with where the public has actually been for a while. And so politicians should not be afraid to put the case as to why we need to keep changing. So if we become the government on the 14th of September, I don't see it as, oh, God, we're really in trouble now. It's actually an opportunity to change the way things are done, to reinforce some of the messages that came out of the way we handled the resources boom, and to be positive about what you can create out of it. Because the fundamentals of the place are really good. But how you manage the place, for good or ill, actually does matter. And that's why who is in the government is important. I should stop there. Thanks.